Hello, you are ready to enter a day of darkness and mystery. Seja muito bem-vindo ao canal Encounter of Fear. Here I bring to you 5 scary stories that will make you question or that really happen in the shadows of the night. Stories of night watches, solitary men who faced confusion when the world was asleep. But before you start, remember, the method is more real when you are sozinho. Then, it's early to stop, open or play, encrevacy the channel, and activate the sininho so as not to lose any terrifying story. Now, without further delay, let's go to the first page story. Hello, my name is Daniel, and I'm a night watchman at an old, abandoned train station. The station, long out of use, was a relic of a bygone era, its once bustling platforms now echoing only with the whispers of forgotten times. I took this job to make ends meet, never anticipating that my nights would be filled with terror. The station was eerily silent every night, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The only sound that disturbed the quiet was the occasional scurry of rats in the shadows or the creak of the old structure settling. The moonlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long, ghostly shadows that danced on the walls. On this particular night, the chill in the air was sharper than usual. I had just completed my usual rounds, checking the locked doors and ensuring no vagrants had taken shelter in the station. The dim, flickering lights seemed to enhance the oppressive atmosphere. As I walked down the long, empty platform, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing abandoned ticket counters and faded advertisements clinging to the walls. Suddenly, I began to hear footsteps. At first, they were faint, like the echoes of a distant memory. I chalked it up to the building's acoustics, but the steps grew louder and more distinct, matching my own pace. I quickened my stride, but the footsteps kept up with me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to look behind me. There was nothing there, just the same empty platform stretching into the darkness. I resumed my patrol, trying to shake off the unease. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was a strange noise coming from the old ticket office. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around inside. I approached cautiously, my flashlight casting eerie shadows across the broken glass and discarded debris. The office was empty, save for the remnants of old ticket stubs and dust-covered counters. As I turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands trembling. When the light finally came back on, I saw that the office door was now ajar, as if someone, or something, had opened it from the inside. I stepped out into the main hall, my breath visible in the cold air. The station felt even more oppressive now. I headed towards the break room, hoping a cup of coffee would calm my nerves. The break room was dark, and as I reached for the light switch, I heard a soft, mournful cry. It was so faint that I thought it might have been my imagination. But then, the cry grew louder, more urgent. I followed the sound to the old waiting room. The room was filled with old benches and abandoned newspapers. The cry seemed to be coming from one of the benches. As I approached, I noticed that a figure was sitting on the bench, its back turned to me. I called out, but there was no response. My flashlight revealed nothing but a dusty, empty seat. I was about to turn away when I felt a sudden chill. The air grew colder, and the room's temperature seemed to drop drastically. The light flickered, and I saw a shadow move across the wall. It was a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to be watching me. The shadow moved closer, and I could feel its presence, thick and suffocating. Panic surged through me. I ran back to the main hall, my footsteps echoing loudly in the vast emptiness. The shadow seemed to follow me, its presence growing heavier with every step. I reached the front entrance, but the doors were stuck, refusing to open. I pounded on the glass, desperate to escape. Just then, the station's old emergency light began to flicker erratically. It cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. In the flickering light, I saw the shadow materialize, a dark, indistinct figure that seemed to be formed from the very darkness of the station itself. Its eyes glowed faintly, watching me with an unsettling intensity. The shadow seemed to reach out toward me, and I could feel an icy chill spread through my body. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. My heart raced as I finally managed to force open the doors and escape into the cold night. I didn't return to the station after that night. I learned later that a previous watchman had disappeared without a trace, and the old station had a history of unexplained phenomena. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the shadow is still there, waiting in the darkness for its next victim. Hello, my name is Marcos, and I work as a night guard at an old museum that houses historical artifacts from ancient civilizations. The museum, once a grand building full of life and knowledge, now stands eerily quiet after dark. My shift starts at dusk, and while the days are filled with the hum of museum goers and the chatter of tourists, the nights are cloaked in a deep, unsettling silence. Every night as I begin my rounds, the atmosphere shifts. The vast, echoing halls, once bustling with life, now feel like they are holding their breath. The artifacts, carefully arranged in their display cases, seem to watch me with an unnerving stillness. As I walk through the dimly lit galleries, the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards or the distant clatter of a falling object is the only sign of movement. But that night was different. It began like any other evening. I followed my routine, checking the locks, making sure no one had sneaked in, and ensuring that the security cameras were all functioning properly. The museum's grand clock chimed 11 times, signaling the start of my night shift. I had just finished my initial inspection of the main hall, where ancient statues stood sentinel over long-forgotten histories. As I approached the ancient Egyptian exhibit, a sudden chill swept through the room. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air felt dense and heavy. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the drafty old building. But then I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A faint rustling that seemed to come from one of the display cases. I approached the sound cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The display case in question housed an ancient sarcophagus. Its ornate carvings were intricate and detailed, depicting scenes from a time long gone. As I leaned in to inspect, I noticed something peculiar. The lid of the sarcophagus was slightly ajar, though I had checked it earlier and confirmed it was securely closed. My heart began to race. I moved closer, the beam of my flashlight revealing the dusty interior of the sarcophagus. Inside, instead of the expected mummies or artifacts, there was only darkness. I reached out to adjust the lid, and that's when I heard it. The distinct sound of a whispered voice, so faint it was barely audible. The whisper grew louder, becoming more insistent. It seemed to emanate from the very walls of the museum. The voice was soft, but filled with a palpable sense of urgency and despair. I turned around quickly, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The whisper seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. As I continued my rounds, the whispers grew more intense. They seemed to follow me, echoing through the empty halls. I reached the medieval armor exhibit, where a suit of armor stood in solitary splendor. The whispering grew louder as I approached the suit, and I noticed that the visor of the helmet was slightly tilted, though it had been in a fixed position earlier. A sudden, sharp noise, a clang, made me jump. It came from the direction of the armor display. My flashlight beam swept across the exhibit, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But as I turned to leave, I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, only to find myself alone, The museum's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist on the walls, and the whispering became almost deafening. I felt as if I was being watched by unseen eyes. Every artifact, every display case seemed to harbor a hidden menace. The climax of the night came when I reached the Natural History Wing, where a large skeletal dinosaur stood towering over the room. The whispering had reached a crescendo, a cacophony of frantic voices that seemed to plead for release. I approached the skeleton, my flashlight flickering wildly. The shadows danced grotesquely across the bones, and then I saw it, a shadowy figure emerging from behind the dinosaur's skeleton. It was a dark, indistinct form, its features shrouded in an impenetrable gloom. The figure moved with a disjointed, unnatural grace, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an eerie, ghostly light. I froze, unable to move as the figure approached. The whispering reached a fever pitch, and I could hear the words clearly now. "You shouldn't be here. Leave. Now." The voice was filled with a desperation that sent chills down my spine. In a surge of panic, I fled from the room, the figure's presence lingering like a cold hand on my back. I bolted for the exit, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The museum's grand doors, usually so heavy and unyielding, seemed to open effortlessly as I rushed out into the night. I never returned to that museum. I learned later that the building had a history of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. Some say it's haunted by the spirits of those whose artifacts were displayed there, restless and tormented. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the whispers and the shadowy figure are still there, waiting in the darkness, seeking to ensnare the next unwary visitor. Hello, my name is Luis, and I work as a night watchman at an old, dilapidated farm on the outskirts of a small, forgotten village. The farm, once a thriving homestead, now stands as a lonely sentinel of times past, its fields overgrown and its buildings slowly crumbling into the earth. I took the job because it seemed straightforward. Watch the property, keep the animals safe, and ensure nothing goes amiss. But what I encountered on my shifts was far from ordinary. The farm is surrounded by dense woods, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The nights are dark and silent, with only the distant howls of coyotes and the rustling of leaves breaking the stillness. My routine involves patrolling the grounds, checking the old barn, and making sure no vagrants or animals have intruded. One particular night stands out among the rest. It was a night like many others, cold, windy and moonless. The sky was a thick blanket of clouds, and the wind howled through the trees, creating an unsettling symphony. As I began my rounds, a sense of foreboding settled over me. The usual creaks and groans of the old building seemed louder, more pronounced. I started with the barn, a massive structure with rotting wooden beams and a sagging roof. The barn had a reputation for being haunted. Locals spoke of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions. I dismissed these tales as mere folklore, but that night the barn felt different. As I approached, I noticed a faint light flickering inside. I knew for a fact that no one was supposed to be there, as the place had been empty for years. I approached cautiously, the gravel crunching under my boots. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the barn's decaying interior, old farming equipment, dusty hay bales, and cobwebs draping every corner. The light was coming from a lantern that was swinging gently from a hook on the wall, its flame casting eerie shadows. As I stepped further inside, the temperature seemed to drop dramatically, and I could see my breath forming visible puffs in the cold air. The lantern's flickering light revealed a figure sitting on an old rotting bale of hay. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned farm clothes, with a weathered face and hollow eyes. His gaze was fixed on the ground, and he did not move as I approached. I called out to him, but he did not respond. My flashlight beam swept across him, and I saw that he was translucent, his form shifting and wavering. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I reached out to touch him, but as soon as my fingers brushed his shoulder, he vanished into thin air. The lantern went out, plunging the barn into darkness. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The wind outside howled louder, and the barn seemed to groan in protest. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the cold dread that had settled over me was unmistakable. I left the barn and continued my patrol, trying to shake off the unnerving encounter. The rest of the night was filled with unsettling occurrences. The sound of footsteps seemed to follow me, echoing behind me in the empty fields. I could hear the faint whisper of someone crying, a sorrowful sound that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The old farmhouse, a creaky structure with broken windows and peeling paint, seemed to watch me with an almost sentient malevolence. As I walked past the farmhouse, I noticed that the front door, which had been firmly shut, was now slightly ajar. I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight revealing the interior. A dusty, abandoned living room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. The air inside was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me, and the room plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in utter blackness. I could hear the faint sound of something, or someone, moving around me. The room seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. I could feel a presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. In the darkness, I heard a voice, low and mournful, yet tinged with an edge of anger. It was speaking in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably accusatory. I fumbled for the door, my hands trembling as I tried to find the handle. When I finally managed to open it, I bolted outside, gasping for fresh air. As I stood outside, trying to steady my breathing, I saw the figure again, the same translucent man from the barn. He was standing near the edge of the property, staring at me with those hollow eyes. The lantern reappeared, its light flickering ominously. The man slowly turned and walked into the woods, his form gradually fading into the darkness. I never returned to the farm after that night. I learned from the locals that the farm had once belonged to a family who had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. Their ghostly figures were said to haunt the place, trapped between worlds, unable to find peace. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the farm's ghosts are still there, wandering the dark fields and waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to cross their path. Hello, my name is Ethan, and I work as a night watchman at an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of a small, isolated town. The asylum, once a bustling institution for the mentally ill, had been closed for decades. The overgrown grounds and crumbling walls spoke of a dark history, long forgotten by most. The job seemed straightforward: patrol the grounds, ensure the building remains undisturbed, and report any signs of vandalism or intrusion. But what I encountered during those long, eerie nights was far beyond anything I had ever imagined. The asylum is a massive Gothic structure with towering spires and narrow arched windows that seem to watch over the property like hollow eyes. The halls are lined with peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and abandoned medical equipment. The air is thick with the smell of mold and decay, and the silence is so profound that it feels almost tangible. On one particularly dark and stormy night, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than usual. The wind howled through the empty corridors, creating an eerie symphony of groans and whispers. The storm outside battered the windows with heavy rain, and occasional bursts of lightning that illuminated the asylum in fleeting spectral flashes. As I began my patrol, the first thing I noticed was that the usual creaks and groans of the building were more pronounced. The sound of dripping water echoed through the halls, and every so often the building seemed to shudder, as if in response to the storm. I made my way through the main hall, where old rotting chairs and broken remnants of medical apparatus lay scattered. My flashlight flickered intermittently, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. I turned the corner into the east wing, where the patient rooms were located. The once pristine rooms were now dark and foreboding, with barred windows and rusted metal beds. As I walked down the corridor, the temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and I could see my breath in the icy air. It was then that I heard it, a faint, distant moan that seemed to drift through the hallways. I stopped, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I shook my head, attributing the sound to the storm or the old building settling. But the moan grew louder, becoming more distinct, a sorrowful and haunting sound that tugged at my very soul. I followed the sound to the end of the corridor, where a door stood slightly ajar. The door led to the old psychiatric ward, a place rumored to be the source of the asylum's darkest secrets. I hesitated, but curiosity and duty drove me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was vast and empty, save for a few old examination tables and shelves cluttered with dusty old medical journals. The moaning was louder now, almost as if it were coming from within the walls themselves. I walked to the center of the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The flashlight's beam swept across the room, revealing nothing unusual, except for one of the old examination tables, which appeared to have been recently disturbed. The air in the room grew colder, and I felt a presence, a palpable sense of dread that made my skin crawl. I approached the table and noticed that it was smeared with what looked like dried blood. My heart raced, and I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I spun around, but again, there was no one there. Suddenly, the moaning stopped. A deep, oppressive silence filled the room, broken only by the howling wind outside. The temperature plummeted even further, and I could see my breath fogging up in the freezing air. The room seemed to contract around me, and the walls appeared to close in, the darkness pressing against me from all sides. I heard a low, guttural growl, a sound so inhuman it made my blood run cold. I turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the corner of the room. It was dark and amorphous, shifting and writhing as if it were made of the very darkness itself. The figure had a twisted, almost grotesque form, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an eerie, malevolent light. Panic surged through me. I backed away, my flashlight flickering wildly. The figure advanced, its movements slow and deliberate. The growling grew louder, filling the room with an almost tangible malice. I fumbled with my radio, trying to call for backup, but the signal was dead, swallowed by the storm and the building's ancient walls. In a frantic burst of adrenaline, I ran out of the room, the figure's presence lingering like a cold shadow. I bolted down the corridor, the growling echoing behind me. The storm outside raged with renewed fury, its winds howling like a chorus of tortured souls. I reached the main hall and saw that the door to the asylum was ajar, swinging back and forth with the wind. As I fled into the night, I glanced back one last time. The asylum stood ominous and silent, the windows like dark, unblinking eyes watching my every move. I never returned to the asylum after that night. I learned from locals that the asylum had a history of experiments and cruelty, and some say the spirits of those who suffered there still haunt the building, trapped in a never-ending torment. To this day, I can't escape the memory of that night. The growling, the shadowy figure, and the oppressive darkness of the asylum remain vivid in my mind. I often wonder if the spirits are still there, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander into their domain. Hello, my name is Daniel, and I worked as a night keeper at an old, isolated lighthouse that stands on a rugged cliff overlooking the tumultuous sea. The lighthouse, built over a century ago, was once a beacon of hope for sailors navigating the treacherous waters. Now, it stands abandoned, except for the occasional watchman who must brave its eerie solitude. The lighthouse is a towering structure of iron and stone, its once bright white paint now peeling and weathered. The narrow, winding staircase spirals upward to the top, where the beacon still shines its light out to sea, a solitary guardian in the darkness. The job seemed simple enough: ensure the light remains operational, maintain the equipment, and keep an eye on the surrounding area. However, the nights were far from ordinary. On one particularly stormy night, the atmosphere was fraught with an unsettling sense of dread. The wind howled fiercely, battering the lighthouse with sheets of rain and waves crashing violently against the rocks below. The storm's ferocity seemed to permeate the lighthouse itself, causing the old structure to groan and creak in protest. As I began my shift, the wind outside was so loud that it felt like a living entity, whispering and shrieking through the narrow gaps in the walls. The sound was almost hypnotic, a constant low moan that seemed to echo through the tower. I made my way up the spiral staircase, the steps slick with rainwater that had leaked through the aging roof. At the top, I checked the beacon and ensured it was functioning correctly. The light cut through the storm, its beams slicing through the darkness like a sword. Despite the storm's fury, I felt a momentary sense of calm. But as I descended the stairs, the unsettling feeling returned, more pronounced than before. I made my way to the lower levels of the lighthouse, where the living quarters were located. The rooms were sparsely furnished with old, musty furniture and faded yellowing wallpaper. The air was heavy with the smell of damp and mildew. I started checking the rooms, ensuring everything was in order. It was then that I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from the lower levels. The sound was intermittent, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I followed the sound to a small storage room at the base of the lighthouse. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, the tapping grew louder. Inside, the room was cluttered with old equipment and discarded supplies. The tapping seemed to come from an old wooden crate in the corner. I approached cautiously, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. As I neared the crate, the tapping stopped abruptly. My heart pounded in my chest. I opened the crate, and inside I found a collection of old maritime logs and papers. Among them was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. I opened it to find pages filled with the scrawled handwriting of a long-deceased lighthouse keeper. The entries were filled with desperate pleas and incoherent ramblings about something being trapped in the lighthouse, something malevolent that would never let them leave. The final entry was a chilling confession. I am trapped here with it. It will not let me go. The light is its prison, and I am its keeper. It wants to take me, to replace me. If you find this, flee before it claims you too. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The storm outside intensified, and the lighthouse seemed to shudder with each crashing wave. I closed the journal and replaced it in the crate, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The storm's howl outside grew louder, and the wind seemed to carry an almost mournful wail. As I turned to leave the room, the temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the cold air. The tapping started again, but this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the walls and vibrating through the floor. I turned to face the darkness, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure emerging from the corner of the room. The figure was tall and indistinct, shrouded in darkness. Its presence was oppressive, and the growling grew louder, more insistent. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in fear. The figure advanced slowly, its form becoming more defined with each step. It had hollow, glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness, and its shape seemed to flicker and waver like a poorly tuned television. The growling was almost deafening now, a sound of pure malevolence. In a burst of adrenaline, I fled from the room, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows as I raced up the stairs. The wind outside screamed in fury, and the lighthouse seemed to be alive with a malevolent energy. I reached the top and locked the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned to the beacon, and to my horror, I saw that it was flickering erratically, as if struggling against some unseen force. The shadows in the lighthouse seemed to stretch and writhe, and I felt the oppressive presence closing in on me. The growling continued, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond my sight. Desperate, I made my way back down the stairs and out of the lighthouse, ignoring the storm's howling and the treacherous path down the cliff. I reached the safety of the nearby town, my heart still pounding with terror. I never returned to the lighthouse. I learned from the locals that the place had a dark history, with tales of previous keepers who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some say the lighthouse is cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who had been trapped there, their souls bound to the beacon's light. To this day, I can't escape the memory of that night. The growling, the shadowy figure, and the chilling presence that seemed to seep into every corner of the lighthouse haunt my dreams. I often wonder if the curse still lingers, waiting for the next soul to take on the role of the lighthouse keeper. If you enjoy this video, there is no need to leave it behind or like it and share it with those who, like you, have the courage to confront it. Inscreva-se the channel and activate the notifications to never lose a new horror story. Imansi or Medo may be more pertu than you imagine. Boa night and sleep well. You can sleep